Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
This episode of the House of Mystery is brought to you by Legacy Food Storage. The best way to protect your family is by being prepared. LegacyFoodStorage.com.
Fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren.
Heard on KCAA 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery, and I'm Al Warren, sitting at the controls. And the other side of the country, we've got the great and only David Rose Martino.
You still got the Rose thing in there, right?
Well, people tend to like that, so you know, let's just stick with Rosie.
Rose.
I would call you Marty, but nobody likes that. So.
Marty.
That's very
Marty from Boston.
Yeah, see, that's what I mean. I was just thinking, that would work, but
yeah,
nobody likes it. So.
They don't like it?
No, people are mean.
They are.
Yeah,
horrible.
They turn into something awful. It's not Marty when it's finished. It becomes something really bad. So we can't say that on air anyway. But so now today, I think it's the first author that we've got from Pegasus. No, actually, it would be the second, because John Copenhaver is one from Pegasus.
Oh. I
don't know if you knew that, but he's
from a
different division, but he's written for them as well, and his second book is through them. So
excellent.
Kind of a coincidence, but this is our first non-John.
Non-John.
So who we've got sitting on the line all the way from Scotland, in his home, ready to have his haggis and talk about his new book. We've got Robert J. Harris. Thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, Robert J. Harris is my authorial name, but people just call me Bob normally. So you can do. You're special guy.
Yeah, well, I don't want to be too personal there right away. But now your book is A Study in Crimson, Sherlock Holmes, 1942. So very interesting take on Sherlock Holmes. What got you into writing this book? Like, why did you go into doing a crime book and with Sherlock Holmes?
Well, it's a bit of a departure. I mean, I started off, my first books I wrote were teen novels that I wrote with my friend Jane Yolen some years back. In my solo career, I wrote a couple of teen historical adventure stories. Then I was writing, middle grade novels. I did a series of comic fantasies set here in St Andrews. And then followed that with the next idea I had was to write, some stories about the young Arthur Conan Doyle. It says schoolboy days, his early teens. And the idea would be, there's only one of them originally I worked out. So I wrote a novel about young Leonardo da Vinci, one about young Shakespeare. So the Conan Doyle is going to be a third in this kind of series of young legends. And so being Conan Doyle, I thought, well, I'll have an adventure in Victorian Edinburgh, which will sort of lay the groundwork for the inspiration for Sherlock Holmes in later years. But my publisher at that point, they looked at this and they said, actually, this would be a great series. Would you write more than just the one? Which gave me a set of freedom. So I've written 3 of those. It's called the Arthur Conan Doyle mystery, in which the young Arthur Conan Doyle in Victorian Edinburgh has to solve the mysteries of grave robbing and sabotaging the Russian back. And in the third book, there's a mysterious invisible thief who's robbing jewels around the town. And in the course of writing these, of course, it crossed my mind. I was trying to make mysteries worthy of Sherlock Holmes, to get that atmosphere from the stories. And that made me think, of course, about maybe writing a Sherlock Holmes novel. The problem with that is there are actually an awful lot of Sherlock Holmes pastiches out there. I barely have read a fraction of them. But once I started looking on my Kindle, I realized that people who've written like 20, and most of them are, trying to recreate kind of Victorian adventure with greater or lesser success. And then there's spin-off things with Moriarty and the Strad and such like. And so I thought, well, if I wrote another Sherlock Holmes novel, nobody would care. Would get no attention. And then one day, my eye lighted upon my box DVD set of the Basil Rathbone Sherlock Holmes films. The first two, which are set in Victorian times, Fox Pictures made those, The Hound of the Baskervilles and then The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Then they dropped the whole thing. They weren't interested in keeping going. I guess they figured there weren't enough good stories available to keep it going. And Universal Pictures stepped in and they said, well, we'd like to take this up. And they made a deal with the Doyle estate. He died in 1930, so the stories are all under copyright. His family still owned the rights to all this. He couldn't just make films of them without actually making a deal with them. And they agreed with Universal's idea to kind of refresh the whole thing by updating it to the 1940s for various reasons. But one of which, of course, was this, during the war, and Sherlock Holmes was a great champion for beleaguered Great Britain at that time. And so that Rathbone and Bruce, Nigel Bruce and Dr. Watson, who played in his first two Victorian films, also were starring in a very popular radio series as Holmes and Watson, set in Victorian times, were very well established. So when they actually made the first of these films, Sherlock Holmes and the Voice of Terror, the transition seemed very, very smooth. And watching them again years later, before any thought came to me to make a novel out of them, I was always struck how easily they just moved into 1940s. Suddenly, you've got aeroplanes and cars, but still Sherlock Holmes, still, Baker Street looks much the same. So I was thinking about this, and the idea came to me, well, nobody's ever thought to take that version of Sherlock Holmes. It's very well established. There were 12 of the Universal Pictures series, and they're always on television, and I grew up on them, and other people did. I thought, well, nobody's ever thought to write a novel taking this version of Sherlock Holmes. So I thought that could work really well, because you've got the template there. You've only got these films, which really do remain loyal to Conan Doyle while updating the thing to the 40s. You've got the great wartime background, and I thought, well, yeah, that could work. That'd be a way to write a Sherlock Holmes novel that's something a bit different. It wouldn't just be trying to redo old versions of Sherlock Holmes. It would be actually something that would be new because this had never been done in a novel before. And so I printed up the basic idea, the picture of Rathbone and Bruce and a title and just a basic blurb for the idea of it, and went to my agent and my editor in Edinburgh. They'd already published my two Richard Haney books. I'm going to be talking an awful lot and things. I've written two period adventure novels set in the early part of the last century, reviving John Buchan's the hero from the 39 Steps, Richard Haney. And they were very happy with those I'd done. So I sent them with this idea for Sherlock Holmes. My editor just said to me, do this next and do 3 of them. So they were quite enthused with just the basic idea. It took a few weeks more before the idea came of the plot of it. Once I got that, though, it really took off and all seemed to fit together really well. So that's as briefly as I can do it, how I came to write the book.
Don't you feel a great amount of pressure writing about a classic like Sherlock Holmes? Like, don't you feel like there's going to be people that automatically don't like what you do because of it and others that love it and all that? Isn't there a great amount of pressure just in the character itself?
Well, I've kind of done that with the not-so-famous Richard Haney from John Buchan's novels. He wrote 5 novels about Richard Haney, and I carried the adventures on into the Second World War, not to get too much length about that. And mostly, the great majority got great reviews, and people who loved Buchan's books wrote to me, and I met them in person, and they said how great it is to have these characters back again. But there's also going to be a few dissenting voices. Someone might say, well, this is like sacred stuff, you shouldn't touch this. But people are entitled to that. So I had a notion that maybe people would not take the World War II Sherlock Holmes. I wanted to be very clear on the cover of books with my editor. So I've got you on the cover. It's got to say this is inspired by the 1940 film series. But I don't want anybody to think, who is this guy? Somebody thinks he can stick Sherlock Holmes in World War II. What a ludicrous idea. I want to make it clear that I didn't come up with this because I thought it'd be a great gag or a great thing for me. So, and I feel that version of Holmes is quite well established. So, pressure, well, there's a pressure in it, yeah, but that just makes you work hard to get it right. So I was all they've been rereading the Conan Doyle stories. for my middle grade series, the Arthur Conan Doyle mysteries. So I was carrying on reading those. So I was getting a really good feel for Dr. Watson's narrative voice and what the characters were like. And so in the course of writing this, I was rereading again and also watching the films. And I think those films do a great job of transposing Holmes and Watson into the 1940s. And so I think I'd absorbed all that. And I found it was actually really, really enjoyable to do, to get into that setting and get into those characters. And, you know, yes, it's hard work, but it was very pleasurable work. I would read a chapter back and think, that's really come off well. That really reads like a proper Sherlock Holmes story. You know, they've got telephones and they're flying in an RAF plane and stuff like that. It all works out really well. Part of the thing with the book was, because I was aware that it's a bit of a transition, people who wouldn't be familiar with the films, and would think, what is this? This is really strange. You shouldn't have Sherlock Holmes in this period. So the first 3 chapters of the book are actually kind of a short story. It's a locked room mystery in the Scottish castle where Sherlock Holmes is flown up there to investigate the disappearance of the scientists inside a locked room. I thought, we'll have this little kind of classic kind of mystery first, and that will bring Holmes and Watson to the forefront, reintroduce to the readers. So they'll feel familiar. They'll feel, yeah, this is Holmes and Watson. This before we get into the more unusual story. And so by the time they come back to London and have to take on these killings, I think the readers who are not already familiar with that setting of Sherlock Holmes would have kind of segued into it. They'd have a sense of comfort with the characters in this new thing, and it would go well. So the reaction I've had, the reviews and that from readers, seems to be a great success, which I'm really happy about. Because what I want to do is for people to really love reading the books and enjoy them and get a great sense of joy out of them, which I get from watching the films and Conan Doyle.
Well, Crimson Jack. Now, who is Crimson Jack, and how do you come up with a character like that?
Well, I had just a throwaway plot that I put on the blurb, the presentation of my editor. But then I was reading through a book called The World of Sherlock Holmes, which is one of those Sherlockian books where you pretend that Sherlock Holmes was real, and you sort of discuss what his life would have been like and what he encountered. And I got to a chapter on Jack the Ripper. Now, Jack the Ripper and Sherlock Holmes have faced each other a few times in Victorian times, in novels and in films. And I suddenly thought, I had this idea of a 1942 story set in the same year as the Universal series began. And I suddenly thought, well, supposing somebody is murdering women on the same dates as Jack the Ripper, and he leaves a signature behind as Crimson Jack. Then Crimson Jack came to me very quickly. This is a really natural variant on Jack the Ripper. The weird thing was that after that, I spent a couple of hours trying to think of a title for the book. And then when I thought, going back to the original titles of the Conan Doyle, the first Sherlock Holmes novel was A Study in Scarlet. And because I had Crimson Jack, it seemed to just obviously fall into place. So I can't say too much about Crimson Jack, because the identity of Crimson Jack is the central mystery of the whole book, of who he is and why he's committing these murders. But yeah, having one of the great things having a kind of Ripper-style murders was, even though we're in London in 1942, it's got that Victorian vibe. This is a kind of a new version of the most famous killer of Victorian London. And instead of having the Victorian fog, we have the blackout because of the German bombing. London blacked out, obviously can't have the light shining anywhere. So obviously it was a great hotbed for crime at the time. So this killer is shrouded in darkness of the blackout rather than in the fog. And so the two things seem to come together really, really well. And so you've got, in a sense, that kind of creepy gothic feel of Jack the Ripper. At the same time, you've got the war raging and all the blackout and other aspects of wartime London.
So how much time does that take to research a time like that? So you're covering it during the war, and because you have to make sure everything in the story is correct to time. Does that take a lot of your time?
Well, there's two aspects to that. One was that I'd already written this novel, The 31 Kings, which is a Fanny novel set in 1940, so I'd written a wartime novel. I'd also done a screenplay based on somebody else's novel set during the war. So I'd done a couple of things. I'd researched that period already because of that. And watching the films, of course, gives you that was a source for how Sherlock Holmes functions in that. I've got a very good friend. Her name's Kirsty Nicol, and she always insists I mention her. But it's quite right too, because she has genealogy. She's got a degree in art history. She's very interested in all sorts of minutiae, and she's access to all sorts of online resources. So if I'm having trouble getting some information about something, I will just email her, and within an hour she'll dot it. I'll say, what sort of meal would they be having at this time of day? And she would know everything they could have under rationing and all things they couldn't have. Things that would take me a long time to find out, and I've got it all about the book. Also, other things about my other aspects of the book were I wanted to have Sherlock Holmes. What would he play on the violin in 1942? Well, I've got a good friend, Dr. Toby Lipman, who is a retired doctor and a violinist, a very good violinist. So he actually gave me medical advice when I had questions about that. And also, when I wanted to talk about music, he gave me a lot of good information for Sherlock Holmes and that. So basically, it's you do as much research as you can yourself. But if you know people who can help you out, that's always great. They know things that you don't. And so the book was read over by my friend Kirsty to check it for any possible problems or flaws. We do that with most of my books now. And if she points out something that's perhaps a little unhistorical, I have to think, well, does it need to be that way to make the story work? I mean, if you're bending things a little bit to make it the story, I think that's permissible, as long as you know you're doing it. So, yeah, I mean, there's certain things that ideas I've had for books to write, but I thought the amount of research involved would be crippling. I would simply couldn't do it. So, yeah, and it's, of course, you find out interesting things. I mean, there's a point in the book where there's a typewritten note that Holmes has analysed. And so I went into that to discover that, in fact, you can, in fact, work out exactly the kind of typewriter that was used in any typewritten note. There are, in fact, whole studies in this and systems for doing it. And this led me to the name of Ordway Hilton, who'd been doing this for the Chicago Police Department, their science department. And he was the document specialist. So Holmes quote him, and he's using Ordway Hilton's method to analyse this typed note they've got. And so finding out all about this, how this all works, how you analyse these things was interesting. And I found that out by myself and put that in. So yeah, it's part of the enjoyment of doing something. But you do just want to make sure you've not made a big mistake. So I do have a fact checker who goes through it for me, and I have some good editors too, my publishers, who will pick up things if I've got something wrong, which hasn't been too much so far. So yeah, that's it's something when I'm aware of. It doesn't feel burdensome. It's a matter of making it an authenticity without beating people to death with your research. You don't spend pages describing wartime London or exactly how things were. That kind of, there's a story to be told, and bringing in the things that are relevant to the story is what's important.
I was wondering how you keep track of your storylines and your characters. Do you have tools, a process, any methods for doing that?
Well, I do a list of all the characters and type up what I know about them. And of course, some of them are like Sherlock Holmes and Watson are not my creations. But the thing with this particular version of Sherlock Holmes, of course, is that Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson in this story can't be exactly the same as Victorian Holmes and Watson. The original Sherlock Holmes is at the end of his career on the edge of World War I. His last adventure, his final bow, takes place just before the outbreak of the First World War, when he's probably about 60. Now, in my story, he and Watson in the late 40s, early 50s, in 1942. So this meant they were young men in the First World War. So I had to construct a different timeline for them. But they had to be the same people. They had to end up being the Conan Doyle characters, but by a different route. It's like if I'm in Scotland and I want to take a train from Edinburgh to Aberdeen, I can either go via Dundee or I can go via Perth. So it's different routes, but when you get to the end, you're still in Aberdeen. So this is the idea of this was to create the new timeline for these characters, but have them end up being the same men, and perhaps have a deeper explanation of why they're like that. There's background to both of them that comes in this story. And of course, it's a heavy responsibility to keep them authentically Holmes and Watson while set in a different time period and with some different life experiences. But at the same time, it gives you certain freedom to explore it. So one of the things I did with that was to take elements of the actors, Basil, Rathbone and Nigel. I made the characters in the book the same age as the actors were. And they both served in the First World War. Basil Rathbone was the captain of a scouts unit, the Liverpool Scottish, And his autobiography begins with a very harrowing adventure running across no man's land, being shot at by the Germans. Nigel Bruce was shot in both legs in Belgium by German machine gun fire. And he was honourably discharged with injuries, but he joined the army again and became an officer in a training camp. So these guys weren't just some sort of wet actors who'd never done any proper work in their life. These were men who stared death in the face. And so I took some of that and put it into the so my Holmes and Watson also served in the First World War in very different ways. And Watson was wounded the same way Nigel Bruce was. So the constructing of that timeline was that was something I had to map out. I had to take I thought there are various versions of the original Sherlock Holmes timeline that Sherlock had done. So I took that, and then I did my paralleling one of my own timeline, starting much later, and I had to write that up. Then there was having a timeline of the events in the war, so much from the war at the time. Then I had a calendar of the days of the mystery. You have to have that, because the dates of the murders are very important. I had to have that and what's happening in between and where it all ends up. So the various timetables and background notes on the characters. Yes, I just keep track of it. I don't really have software things. I just type up a lot of stuff. And but once you've written something down, it tends to stick in your mind. But I would check something occasionally. And I always have a list of all the characters in the book that I add to it. I add characters to the book and make little notes about them. I don't just keep it all in my head all the time. I mean, I'm not clever enough for that. But I have lots of notes on my computer that I can check up on to make sure I'm keeping things consistent and that it all makes sense. That something that should take 3 days doesn't happen in the space of an hour. Like that.
Well, do you have a subtext? Do you have a meaning? Do you have something that you hope people get from the book other than the story itself?
I think writing these kind of period adventures, like Richard Hannay book and this book and its sequel that I finished recently, there are, against the background of war, a lot of things are magnified. Questions of honour and justice. So there's a great theme of justice in this book. Holmes talks about justice, and the novel's split into 3 parts. The first part's called deduction, the second part's called investigation, and the third part is called justice. So there are certain, I suppose, philosophical questions regarding the nature of justice that run through it. But that is kind of a subtext, and I would think by the end of the book, we just might be looking at it and have a few thoughts about that. But in a sense, you don't want to hammer on too much about stuff. I think the great sense that I think the sense of what these men have been through in experiences during wartime. Dr. Watson also we go into his read for the death of his wife some years earlier. Watson is widowed in Conan Doyle stories, but not very much is made of that. So I make a bit more of that in this book. I have Watson reflect about a moving death of his wife. So there's kind of thematics and there's kind of emotional resonances to it that I hope people will take away from it and really enjoy getting an emotional sense from the characters. Late in the book, Sherlock Holmes is sort of turned to Watson, one of his experiences in the Great War, in the First World War, that to a large extent it's molded his career and made him the man he is. And I think that's a strong story and very moving. And so I think those are the things at the end of it all people will have. It's not just a romp, it's not just a lark and a bit of fun. There's actually a lot of depth to it emotionally and thematically. By the end of it, will stay with people as well as the happy glow of having enjoyed a really, really exciting, intriguing story.
I read that you're a fencer, and I'm just wondering if you've ever had the opportunity to use that in any of your novels or short fiction.
Yeah. Well, I haven't done it for a while because my knee's gone, but probably because of the fencing. But I do mention in this book that Holmes is on the Cambridge fencing team at university. So, where Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes is an expert boxer, which is one of the interesting aspects of him as a character. He's actually very athletic. I kind of thought a later version of Holmes, making him a skilled defender would be good. So I have recently completed all the editing on the second of my Sherlock Holmes novels, which is The Devil's Blaze, Sherlock Holmes 1943, which brings in Professor Moriarty and Colonel Sebastian Moran, Moriarty's henchman. And there is, in fact, in the first part of the book, a pretty exciting fencing match between Sherlock Holmes and Colonel Sebastian Moran. And my wife is the first editor of my book. She she's the first person to read the book and edits them ruthlessly and cruelly and tells me anything that's just not good enough and makes me work harder to make them really good. And when she read that, she said, that's really good. You can tell you have fenced because you know how it all works. And this is it's supposedly a sporting thing with the two of them. The swords have got, covers on them so you can't stab somebody with it. But I having fenced, some rather wild fencing matches, even with some guarded blades, you can get pretty seriously bruised, doing those. A friend and I were fencing, we were actually warned for a fencing match to tone it down. We were being too vicious. So you could do a pretty violent fencing match, even when it's not to the death. So I'm very pleased that came out and I got the chance to use some of that knowledge in the story and to present Holmes as a really good fencer. So yeah, I did get to use that. And I think also because Basil Rathbone was actually an expert fencer. He was twice an army fencing champion. And recently we were watching The Mark of Zorro, where he fences Tyrone Power, and Rathbone is the villain. It's one of the greatest fencing matches in any film ever. And but they can do that because Rathbone himself is so good at it. And he fences Robin Hood and other things around him. So that it was partly a tribute to that man to give Sherlock Holmes a scale and have them demonstrate it in an extended fencing match in the second book of my Sherlock Holmes adventures. I enjoyed that tremendously, being able to do that and then use that experience. So yes, that did come into play. One of my more physical talents. So I don't have that many practical talents, but that was one that came into play.
I was going to say, with your wife being the editor, you probably have to fence.
Well, she fenced briefly, not as long as I did. But she's a writer before me. That inspired me to get into writing. She's a fancy adventure. She's got a whole series of books with Catherine and Kirk together. And then she was teaching creative writing and had her own private editing business. So that her editing me is sometimes a tense experience. It can be quite tense sometimes. If we disagree over something, that I say, well, no, it's fine the way it is. No, you have to change it. But what it means is it gives me a confidence. Like when I finish the book at home and send off my publisher, I know it's in really good shape. And so anything I back from publisher, there's never any major things wrong with the book. There's only little things they want to polish or things like that a little bit. So and that's nice to have that to know when the book goes out that it's in really good shape. It can work all these suffering. And our marriage holds together very well. I mean, we're still, it's our 40th anniversary next year. So I think ultimately it strengthened it, the fact we do work together on things. When she was writing, I kind of pitched in here and there, helping out with bits of that, not the editing. And so we've worked together on these things over the years, and I think it's been good for us to do that. And it gives me, I say, great confidence that I'm writing. If there's something I've missed, something that I've maybe not hit the right note on, she'll read it and spot it and tell me what to do. And also she does quite a bit of research as well. She will research things while I'm writing, knowing what's coming up in the story. So I've got a kind of a researching team, which is a fantastic benefit to have. Not everybody's got that. And so having this support network of family and friends is great. And everything I get from my publisher over here from Berlin Polygon Books is very, very good. But sometimes spotting things, I thought, gosh, I can spot that. So that's not quite correct. So it's kind of a team effort. Although I am writing this. I do the hard work after writing it, which is time consuming. I'll have my name on the cover of the book because I think I deserve that.
So your characters, where do you get all your characters from in the story? Like the outside characters, are they people you know, people you've seen somewhere? Where does that come from?
I don't really base them on people I know mostly. Obviously, the hardcore of characters in this book, there's Holmes, Watson, Mrs. Hudson, Inspector Lestrade, and Mycroft Holmes come up, and Wiggins from the regulars, who's now a young man and a fire warden in London. All the other characters, of course, invented by me for the story. One of the most important is Gail Preston, who's an NBC radio reporter in London at the time, who was very much part of the whole investigation. And she's inspired by Helen Hyatt, who was a railway reporter at this time. She reported a radio broadcast from while the war was in London and on the continent. And she wrote a book about it. her experiences. So she inspired that. I was looking for a strong female character, and I thought, well, yeah, an American woman in London working for NBC, that's good. And she has a very pivotal role to play in the story. Part of the fun of the thing is, well, I was writing the book I was imagining it as a film made in the 1940s and casting as many people as I could in all the various roles. Obviously, because we've got Rathbone and Bruce and Miss Hudson and Dennis Hoy's version of Lestrade are all coming from the film. But I kind of, as a game, was just casting everybody as I went along. So I cast Alice Faye in the role of Gail Preston, who is not as famous as she should be now, but she had a fantastic career in musicals and drama in Hollywood. But then in the 40s, she retired. She married Harris, which is a very married Phil Harris, a band leading comedian, and gave up this whole career to raise their family, with their daughters, which a mark of John's character. I mean, they were together until death. They also had a family. So, and seeing her in films like Gail is played by Alice Faye, and Eric Bloor, who played a lot of comic roles in 30s and 40s films, there's a part for him in it, and all the way through it, I was able to find somebody for all the parts. Then you come up with the characters, I don't know, this spring into mind. It's like, there's not really a method for creating characters. Have a somewhat slimy reporter, which I feel unfair about it. I feel most of it aren't slimy as this guy is. And a repugnant artist turned up in it as well. And that was fun to write. I guess it's writing characters who aren't very nice are actually much more fun to write. And of course, when you're writing a mystery like this, it's a matter of, there should be lots of characters in it because they're the suspects, which one of them is the murderer and why are they doing it. So you do present characters who are interesting in themselves and have their own kind of story to carry on. And so they seem to pop into my head and then and go from there. But this is a bonus of, and we put it online at some point. I do have an entire cast list for the whole film, with every part that's being played in it. And it's an actor and actress for every one of them. Just because it's fun to imagine it actually being a 1940s black and white film. I think that's all I have to say about the characters.
Well, I'm wondering too, with your characters, when you create your characters, do you have an inner monologue in your head? Can you hear your characters? I know I hear voices. that's the joke. But how does that work for you?
Oh no, but yeah, well, I don't know if you guys got a writer here. Yeah, I figure my strength as an author are plotting and dialogue, and I think the characters come out mainly in the dialogue, the way they speak, the things they say. And so, Holmes and Watson, of course, have a very sort of high diction. They're highly educated men and still kind of old-fashioned, even though they're not Victorian gentlemen. They've been to public schools and they have that kind of thing. Whereas, say, Inspector Lestrade, he's not much of a character in Conan Doyle, but Dennis Hoy's Lestrade is not a common man character. And I really enjoyed writing for him, giving him a kind of almost Cockney richness to his expression. He's got lovely turns of phrase that are things that Holmes and Watson wouldn't say. And so his character comes out very much in that. And then his attitude of being not really a plodding policeman, but actually a good sort of hard-working chap at the job. And then with having a character of Gail, a method character that she of course talks in a way totally different to anybody else in the book. She has a kind of slangy American way of talking. It was also really fun to write, especially when it's set in a kind of 40s thing there. And so I find that as well as a slight physical description, I think the dialogue about the characters, the things they say, really bring out. Another nice touch to these things written in this period is, and these days everybody smokes. And so people can, there's pipes and cigars and cigarettes, and that, these are great props when characters are doing things. You can light a cigarette in a certain way and stub it out decisively, and that makes a statement. Or they can blow smoke slowly while they're thinking. And there's all these things you can do with that as a prop, which nowadays people can't smoke in their story would be really odd. It would be a thing that would be too much. Where then, it's a whole thing, Holmes and his pipes and all that, are all very much part of the whole milieu. And once again, they're character expressive. There's somebody who smokes cigarettes all the time, but they have the occasional pipe when they're thinking. That's it. They smoke big cigars. And so that's a period thing that allows you to to give that aspect to the characters that you couldn't really do in the same way now.
Now, do you have a website or a place that people can find you or find out more about your books and stuff?
Yes. At the end of every one of my books, I have an author's afterword to explain a couple of things. At the very end, it has my website, which is www.harris, HARRIS, -authors, AUTHORS.com, all small case. And that has biographical information about me. It's got stuff about the book, it's got all my books listed, things about them, a few articles I've written in connection with the book. It's also got stuff about my games that I've made, and my wife's books are featured on there as well. So it's a treasure chest of fascinating information, which I'm still trying to add to. I've made up this cast list for the novels, and I need to get that actually online as well. It's friends that run the website for me, so I have no idea how to do it. So I just send them things, and then when they've got time, they'll put them up there. I really appreciate the work they do for that. So yes, that's it. You just go around and find me, Robert DeHarris, and you'll find this on there. There's also links to a comedy podcast that I do with my friend Alan McFadden, which will give you material for now. It's called Quantum Fridge. It's a comedy podcast company, and we have a fabulous cast, and we do comedy shows, science fiction and mystery and adventure comedies that we do. Also, there's links to that too. So anybody plunging into the Harris website will find games, comedy, novels, and everything your heart could desire, other than whiskey and cigars.
Oh, too bad. Well, we'll have that actually linked up to our site as well, so people listening can do one click.
That'd be great. Yeah,
so that's easy. And
a nice thing too is because people can contact me through the website, and it's really nice to go right to me and say, I want to have enjoyed the book. That really take the time to do that, because you don't get the direct experience of people enjoying the book because it's kind of distant. I've been writing for our podcasting about when Alan and I wrote a comedy which was recorded by the BBC many years ago, and it was a big live event, and they called a play, a pie, and a pint. And we had a pint of beer and a Scotch pie. They were watching this comedy we put on about American and Scots. And it was fantastic to have written something and be sitting there in an audience that was just enjoying the hell out of it. They were laughing and cheering and such like, according to Angel. And that's a great thing to get. Also, because about my younger books, my books I've written for middle grade kids, I've done a lot of visits to schools and I get to put on plays for the kids and do story making lectures with them. And it's wonderful having them react. How much do they enjoy it? How enthusiastic they are about all this stuff. And so I think when you're sitting at home by yourself writing a novel for grown-ups, you send it out there, you don't get that kind of thing. So people do write. I really appreciate that when you get in touch and say want to enjoy the book and ask for more. Luckily, as I've mentioned, people ask me, are you going to do any more of these? Yes, it's all done. It's going to be coming out. Well, it's coming out over here next year, and I'm hopefully Pegasus will be very keen to do it again. Another one, because it seems to go down very well over in the States, getting great reviews in major publications, and getting obviously people like you that are taking interest in it, which is great, because the worst thing for any author is to put all the heart and all the talent into a book, and then it just disappears. Nobody even knows about it. It's not nothing to do with whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. People don't read it because they didn't hear about it. So you want attention for the book. So I'm really glad that the concept of doing a 1942 Sherlock Holmes based on this film has intrigued enough people that it's actually getting quite a bit of attention, and that means people will hear about it and give it a try. And I hope they'll all enjoy it. I hope they'll enjoy it tremendously. That's what I want more than anything else. People will read it, have a fantastic time reading it. We'll just be completely absorbed in it. And we'll get to the end of it all, they'll feel really satisfied and be gasping for more, because there is more.
Wow, there you go. Well, we appreciate it. How was writing during the pandemic for you? Did it affect you at all?
Not much different, because you're just in the home. We were lucky. Last summer, we've got a nice garden. We live in a nice neighbourhood. We've got a dog, so we can take the dog for walks on the beach and everything. With stuff like this, keeping in touch online with people is really great. We have to contact family and friends on Skype. We have weekly meetings with family. Particularly with my son, who works in publishing too. He and I meet on a Skype session with a few beers. We called it man Skype. So we were able to still, have the kind of chat we normally have, and another friend of mine, he joined in with it too. And it was just great to kind of sit around and do the kind of talking you do with your friends and your family. It was nearly as good as actually being there, and it meant you didn't lose that. So, because you didn't have contact with people. And then earlier this year, we put together a bunch of writers online to celebrate the friend Gino's birthday. We got about 10 writers online together on a Zoom thing. And it's just really nice to stay in touch with other writers as well and see what they are doing. So, yeah, I mean, for what we do, we work at home like this. I know some people, this has been a terrible time for them, what they've had to go through. They're stuck in an apartment block with their 4 kids who can't go to school. All this, it must be really, really tough. So it's been easy for us, because our kids are all grown up. Yeah, some writers I've seen online saying, I can't concentrate. No, it didn't really affect me. It's been pretty soft for me. I appreciate how easy this has been for me compared to how some people who've got difficult jobs to do and, look after. So it didn't really impinge, although, writing about World War II, it's not the same thing, but life was restricted then by rationing and blackouts and things. And the restrictions we've got now, I think, well, comparatively slight, really.
Yeah.
But I'm hoping it'll all be over soon.
Yeah.
And go do some traveling.
Yeah. Well, it's been a great show. Thank you for coming on. Our book today that we're talking about is A Study in Crimson, Sherlock Holmes, 1942. And the author was our guest, Robert J. Harris. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks for taking interest in the book. I hope that your listeners will go and try it out and really enjoy it. And be back for the next one.
I'm sure they will.
To find out more about our show, guests, or to listen to past shows from our archive, please go to www.houseofmysteryradio.com.
The mission has been completed.
The end! By George, he's got it! It is the end! I'll tell you.
If you're lying to me, I'll be back.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.